philosophy of nursing 4 years, following our speaker this afternoon after her 13 years chairing this organization. So I'm delighted to introduce to you today Professor Janet Holt. She's going to deliver the inaugural lecture in the Steve Edwards Memorial Lecture Series. So this special lecture series was instituted in order to honor Steve Edwards. He was the main visionary and the founder and supporter of the idea that there was needed a special venue to allow the investigation and discussion of a multitude of philosophical issues that swirl around nursing and healthcare. Nursing is a practical, hands-on activity, and philosophy, of course, is a theoretical, stand away, stop, and think about things, and so there doesn't seem to be any natural connection between the two. But Steve and some of his colleagues at the time were struggling with how philosophical issues were kind of coming up in the day-to-day practice in which they were working. And they were struggling, as we continue to struggle today, to find a venue in which to discuss these ideas and in which to publish their thoughts about philosophical concerns around nursing and healthcare. So over a few years then, and with much hard work, IPONS and the journal Nursing Philosophy came into being. So we owe Steve and his friends a huge debt of gratitude. And I think I am particularly happy to be able to honor him and them today. So as you may have seen in your program, Dr. Janet Holt is a woman who has worn and continues to wear many hats. She's a registered nurse, she's a midwife, she's a philosopher, an ethicist, a researcher, a teacher, and a mentor. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in philosophy and ethics and a PhD in psychology. She is currently an associate professor in healthcare ethics in the School of Healthcare at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. But she's also serving as a lecturer, a dissertation director, an external examiner in fields of nursing, healthcare, and law at universities in England, Ireland, Scotland, and Pakistan. She has previously held visiting lectureships in the United States, New Zealand, Finland, and 2 universities in Pakistan. I think it's pretty clear from all that she's considered a leader in her various fields. She's published more articles than you can shake a stick at, both independently and in collaboration with a multitude of colleagues. So along with Steve Edwards, Keith Cash, John Drummond, and Joan Liashenko, Dr. Janet Holt was a founding member of the International Philosophy of Nursing Society, IPONS. She's never missed a conference. She served as the secretary, the vice chair, and the chair, retiring as the chair in 2018, in 1992. Anyway, here we are. So she's hosted 3 or co-hosted 3 International Philosophy of Nursing conferences, and she has regularly presented at these conferences over the year. So because this year we celebrate the 25th annual conference, we missed one during COVID. It serves, this conference serves as the perfect venue, I think, to launch this prestigious Steve Edwards Memorial Lecture. And so I hope that you will join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Janet Holt.
Thank you, Catherine, for that very nice introduction. I said to Catherine when she sent me it, I said, you've got to remember I'm British, you know, we're not used to these kinds of, these sorts of things, and one scarcely recognizes oneself from these introductions, but thank you very much. I'm extremely honoured to be here and didn't actually expect to be at another IPONS conference, having given up the chair a while ago. But I am very, very honoured to give this inaugural Stephen Edwards Memorial Lecture at what is our 25th International Conference. So I'd like to particularly thank Miriam and her colleagues in the organising committee and this great venue for putting on this terrific conference, particularly a hybrid conference. I can't imagine what's gone on behind the scenes, Miriam, to make sure that this works as well as it does. So thank you very much for that. And I'd also like to thank IPONS particularly for honouring Steve Edwards with this. I think it's a terrific gesture, and I know his family are very, very pleased about it and are interested in knowing how things went. And I'm going to be reporting back to them. This is Steve. You see the picture in the conference programme. He was a professor of philosophy of healthcare at the University of Swansea, which is in Wales, part of the UK, and was absolutely instrumental in the development of nursing philosophy in the UK. He was the catalyst in bringing together individuals who were largely unknown to each other and who were interested in nursing philosophy and who've subsequently gone on to work together to further the discipline. There's not many of us left, actually, in that original gang, but most people have kind of moved on to other things now, and I'll mention them later on. But I never did kind of work out how Steve managed this. I don't know how he did know us all, because we were from different areas of the UK, also international, people like Per Nordfeldt in Oslo, and people in the States as well, like John Lysenko. And I never did know how he knew us all and managed to get us all together, but he did. And the rest, as I say, is history. So through his leadership of the early conferences, establishing IPONS and the journal Nursing Philosophy, he laid the foundations that allow us to continue to meet, discuss and write about nursing philosophy 26 years later. As Catherine's already alluded to, we missed a year. So it's the 25th conference in the 26th year. In the obituary that Keith Cash and I wrote in Nursing Philosophy after Steve's very untimely death, we described his rather unorthodox route to becoming a professor with leaving school without university level entry qualifications, working as a care assistant, looking after people with mental disabilities, which had a profound effect on his thinking and subsequent writing. And then as a musician in a punk band. So he certainly had a very eclectic route to getting there. Many of you probably only know Steve through his writing, but for those of us fortunate enough to have known him personally and as a friend, he was a phenomenal scholar. Steve would always have the perfect, incisive questions ready at the end of a presentation, but always delivered in a very kind and considerate manner. He was a very, very unassuming man. His summing up of conference proceedings was legendary, and I've never known anybody be able to do this in quite the same way. At the end of every conference, he literally would just stand up, no notes, and just sum up all the papers and send us off on our way with this wonderful summary of what we had heard. He set the bar very high for those who was following in his footsteps, organising subsequent conferences. Steve invited me to be a keynote speaker at the very first Philosophy of Nursing conference, so it feels very poignant for me to be here 25 years later doing the same thing. Although it would have been much more fitting, and indeed you would have had a much, much better paper should Steve have been able to do this himself. So once again, I'm very honoured to be here to do this. In the last 29 years, I've worked in nursing education at the University of Leeds, and I know there are not many UK people here, so I thought I'd better start off by showing you where Leeds is, kind of in the, more or less in the middle of the country, really towards the north of the country. Leeds is a large city, at least by UK standards, not necessarily by American standards, but by UK standards, in Yorkshire and situated towards the north of England. Founded in 1904 the university belongs to the Russell Group of research intensive universities in the UK. And research in this context is taken very broadly, although I will return to this theme later on. Our campus has beautiful green spaces and an interesting collection of buildings spanning our heritage. And I put a few of them on there for you to see. It's rather a muddle of buildings, and I'm somewhat envious of these beautiful spaces around here. But we have everything from the brand new Laidlaw Library, which is our newest building, to our beautiful Art Deco Parkinson building, to our brutalist architecture of the 60s, and then the Clothworkers Hall, which is part of the oldest building. So the School of Healthcare, which is where I work, is in this building here. And along with the Great Hall and the Clothworkers Hall are some of the oldest buildings on the campus and part of what was the original Yorkshire College. Our school is multidisciplinary with undergraduate and postgraduate programs in adult, child and mental health nursing, midwifery, social care and counselling, as well as PhD students studying with world-class researchers. So this is why I use this term healthcare more than just nursing, because we have been very keen in our school to be more inclusive. The social workers get very cross with us talking about healthcare all the time. And I know some of you will work particularly in nursing departments, but I think that might have something to do with how things like nursing and nursing philosophy have evolved, or not, as the case may be, in my own institution. I called my presentation Whither Nursing Philosophy, using the literary meaning of whither, that is, to what place. I appreciate this could be a rather risky decision. I was kind of pleased with myself when I came up with Whither Nursing Philosophy, and then I thought, gosh, I better say pretty quickly what I mean about it, because perhaps a more recognisable understanding is this interpretation of whither, to fade away. Hence my title could be interpreted as a normative instruction, perhaps with an exclamation mark at the end, Whither Nursing Philosophy. But my title is a question. And that question is Whither Nursing Philosophy, meaning to what place? Or in other words, what is the future of nursing philosophy? And this seems, at the 25th anniversary of the conference, to be an appropriate philosophical question to ask. I should add here that my presentation is essentially a personal reflection. I've indulged myself a little bit in doing that in this memorial lecture. And I'm going to attempt to look back on and look at the future of nursing philosophy. My reflections are also largely based on the UK experience and my education in philosophy in the British analytical tradition. I apologise for both of these things, but I am British and a product of British universities, so I can't really talk about much else. I appreciate this may be different to the experience of many of you here, but I hope in taking this approach, it will give a foundation for interesting comparisons and useful debate in the interest of adding to the discipline. I was kind of struck this morning in the presentation thinking about continental philosophy, which when I did my undergraduate philosophy degree barely figured on the syllabus whatsoever. You know the department I come from, so it didn't figure on it at all. There was one little module in the second year for those people who wanted to really know something about what these strange French people were up against, but it didn't feature in my education. And I look forward to discussing some of these other points with you. So my plan for the talk is as follows. I'm going to begin with some thoughts on the history of nursing philosophy, its development as a subject, and the scholarly activities as to where it sits today. So expanding on some of the things that Catherine has already said. And I should add also the caveat that this is also from a British perspective. We were, of course, aware of the other movements in nursing philosophy outside of the UK, but I'm really concentrating on how IPONS is generated from a British perspective. About the establishment of the journal Nursing Philosophy and the annual Nursing Philosophy Conference and the establishment of IPONS. In the middle section of my paper, I'm going to explore the present position of nursing philosophy, essentially in the academy. I'm going to make a case for graduates and registered nurses to develop analytical skills, along with the opportunities for philosophical methods to be used as a means for developing these skills. And in the final section of the paper, I'm going to look to the future and what the role of philosophy might be in shaping nursing as a discipline and in the preparation of future practitioners, and addressing what I've thought of as some of the fundamental philosophical questions central to understanding contemporary nursing in a globalised world. So that's where I'm going to go with that. So I'm going to start in the past. Well, I'd like to begin then with some reflections on the influence of IPONS and the development of nursing philosophy and the scholarly activities that lead to where it sits today. It all began in September 1997 at the first UK Philosophy of Nursing conference held at the University of Swansea and organised by Steve Edwards and two of his colleagues, Louise de Reeve and the late Paul Wainwright. Steve, as I mentioned earlier, had somehow managed to get together this group of people, of speakers, who had an interest in philosophy, usually for one of two reasons. Either because they were nurses who were also graduates in philosophy, or they were philosophers who had become involved in teaching in nursing departments. At this time in the late 90s, there were big changes in nursing education in the UK. It was moving out of certificate-led courses into what were then diploma courses, some undergraduate, but mainly diploma nurses. And colleges found themselves needing to rely on individuals in other departments to help them out. So there were quite a few people who ended up teaching, particularly ethics, in nursing departments, having never met nurses before. And some of these people, particularly people like Trevor Hussey and particularly John Paley, a great friend of IPONS, were involved in this and came together to present at this first conference. The conference was very well attended. Many came who were working on PhDs and wrestling with notions of ontology and epistemology as part of their research journey. I've never been terribly sure why people do this in British PhDs, but they tend to. So they came along to this nursing philosophy conference, and we never saw many of them again. I don't quite know what they expected, but I don't think they got what they were hoping for in the answers to their questions. But the following year, under Steve's leadership, we produced a rather modest volume of philosophical issues in nursing under his editorship. And then 4 more annual conferences later, which were held in Swansea, and by 2000, the idea of forming a society started to be discussed. There were a few of us committed to taking things forward, and we got together at the 6th conference in Dublin in 2002 and decided that we needed to get things started. We did have discussions and meetings. This was before the days of hybrid things and one thing and another. And we did have discussions about this over a couple of years. And we were struggling with the notion of how do you start a society with officers when you haven't got any membership in order to elect the officers. And we must have spent, typical philosophers, we must have spent a couple of years trying to sort this one out. And then eventually somebody said, I think it was John Drummond, said, oh, for goodness sake, let's just appoint ourselves. So we did. And we got things started by appointing Steve Edwards and Joan Lysenko to be the joint chairs. I would act as the secretary and the late John Drummond would act as treasurer. And we thought what we'll do is we'll get it going and then we'll have formal elections. They can get rid of us if they want to. Needless to say, they didn't. But we need to get it started and then get a membership together. So that's what we did. And we got the society up and running. But of course, we were aware that our colleagues in North America, under the leadership of Dr. June Kikuchi, already had the Institute for Philosophical Nursing Research at the University of Alberta, and of the Philosophy in the Nurses World Conference held in Banff. But at that time, this was a closed conference by invite only. And we wanted to do something not only closer to home, but something that would reach a wider audience, and particularly getting more people involved in the UK and in Europe. Discussions were held with June, who was highly sceptical, I have to say, of what we were trying to do. And these discussions were held with June so she could see that what our aims were, and that we saw IPONS as being complementary to, but not in competition with, what was happening in the Canadian Centre. And the International Philosophy of Nursing Society was officially launched in September 2003 at the 7th International Philosophy of Nursing Conference, organised by John Paley, held at the University of Stirling in Scotland. But prior to setting up IPONS, Steve had been trying for several years to get a publisher interested in a journal, a nursing philosophy journal. He had a very clear remit of what he wanted that journal to be, in providing a forum for discussion of philosophical issues in nursing. It wasn't to be a journal that would publish empirical research. It would be a journal that would be solely devoted to philosophical ideas in nursing. And it also wasn't going to focus on ethics. The journal Nursing Ethics was already well established under the editorship of Professor Verena Tschuden, and more difficult conversations ensued with Verena, so that she understood that we weren't trying to get involved in the ethics as well. And she was very happy about that. And the idea of this journal in nursing philosophy was eventually taken up by a Blackwell, now Wiley Blackwell, under the editorship of Steve and Joan Lysenko. The journal's had a relatively stable editorship over its 22 years in existence. Steve remained editor until 2008, jointly with Joan and later with Patricia Rodney from Canada, as well as having a period as sole editor. Derek Selman succeeded him, followed by a brief period under Jan Dewing, and the current editors, Miriam Bender and her colleague Stefanos Mantzoukas, began their term of office earlier this year. There was always a close tie between the journal and IPONS. The journal was described as the official journal of IPONS, and members at that time received a copy as part of their membership. There's usually an annual special edition based on papers presented at the conference, and under Derek Selman's editorship, the annual Student Essay Prize was launched, with the winner being given the opportunity to present at the conference. Over the last 25 years, we've seen a lot of changes in IPONS. We've lost members as people's academic interests and career pathways change. Some have retired, and sadly some have died. Not only Steve, but other major figures in nursing philosophy, as June Kikuchi, and other figures who played a large part in IPONS. Daniel Blondeau, Paul Wainwright, and John Drummond, and just last week, Jan Dewing. But we've also gained new members who've joined the executive committee, deciding the way forward. The journal continues to thrive with new leadership, and the conference continues to be held annually in international venues across Europe and North America, and perhaps somewhere else. I think of particular note is that in 2019, the 13th Philosophy in the Nurses World Conference was held jointly with the 23rd IPONS Conference in Victoria, British Columbia. This, I think, was a fantastic collaboration and a sharing of mutual interests. I know Brenda Cameron did a lot to open up that conference in Banff, so it stopped being just an invite only. But I think actually pulling the two together was really useful. I'm not really sure what's happening with that conference now, but I'm hoping that these sorts of collaborations will continue. New ways of working have brought about this hybrid conference, and what a brilliant way this is to reach more people. I think it means it will be more accessible, and the contents and presentations can be enjoyed by those unable to travel long distances, and hopefully engage with a wider audience. I've always been very keen to engage with a wider audience, something that my late colleague John Drummond and I disagreed about. He was quite happy if they had 10 people around the table talking about it. John did organise a couple of conferences in Dundee, but he never seemed to have to worry about satisfying the accountants and balancing the books, which those of us who do have to organise conferences usually have to. So I always wanted a few more than 10. So much then for our past, and I just wanted to spend a bit of time not only in just making you aware of this huge debt that we do owe Steve and some of our other founders in getting to where we are. So let's move on now to the present, and this is, I would say, this does come with a government health warning that it is very much a personal reflection. So I'm going to reflect on where I see the position of nursing philosophy today. So there does seem to be, in the UK at least, an imbalance between what are seen as useful subjects and others considered nice but not essential. For example, in 2021, the UK government was reported as saying that arts and creative courses were not strategic priorities, and directed the Office of Students to reduce funding for these sorts of courses by 50% per year. A statement from the Department of State for Education said, this reprioritisation is designed to target taxpayers' money towards subjects that support the NHS, science, technology and engineering, and the specific needs of the labour market, the so-called STEM subjects that we refer to in the UK. Consequently, there's evidence that some universities are cutting courses, for example, in history, English literature, philosophy, as some examples. And this is very interesting because when I was, you know, a young person thinking about degrees, sort of age 18, you know, you couldn't have got into an English literature course unless you were really brilliant, because they were really overpopulated and people wanted to do these kinds of subjects. Nowadays, we're seeing falling numbers, people taking these kinds of subjects in the pursuit of a useful subject that will give you a skill and entry into the labour market. So while the emphasis on funding subjects that support healthcare is welcomed, it does indicate to me some underpinning assumptions about what is considered to be valuable and worth investing in British society. Such views, of course, are not left unchallenged. The Arts Council of England, for example, draws attention to the fact that there are financial considerations in here. The Arts Council suggests that arts and culture contribute 10.6 billion to the UK economy. So it's useful in that respect. Arts and culture help to tackle social injustice through things like theatres, museums, galleries, and they not only bring prosperity, but also bring people together and make life worth living. But the arguments about how we are going to develop creative industries to keep producing 10.6 billion is going to be very difficult if we don't continue to educate people in these sorts of degrees in the first place. British creative industries are considered to be successful across the world with important trading links. So the Arts Council would want to suggest you can't do any of these things unless you invest in this type of education in the first place. So by placing healthcare alongside science and technology as worthy subjects to be supported leads to a further underlying assumption about the nature of healthcare, and that it too is principally based in science and technology. And if this is the case, then such assumptions will in turn influence the research agenda as well as the content of the curriculum and what is considered to be valuable knowledge for nurses to know in order to nurse. Now, I'm using that term healthcare there, but I am specifically thinking about nurses. Clearly, science is crucially important in healthcare, but there are other subjects in the humanities which are also important, such as understanding our history, how we've developed as a profession, the social determinants of health, ethics and the influence of law, both in statute and in cases, none of which you will find in science. In the UK, the position of nursing philosophy in universities does appear to be tenuous, but this looks not to be solely a British problem. In a recent article reporting the discussions from an IPONS live streaming event in August 2020, Olga Petrovska from the University of Victoria, Canada, who you'll hear from tomorrow, reflected on the problems of aligning empirical and philosophical programs of research. And she noted that, I thought very nicely, it's almost impossible to imagine an early career faculty member in a nursing department choosing the field of nursing philosophy as the sole focus of scholarship. And at most, one is advised to do nursing philosophy in addition to a program of traditional health science research. And of course, I know that is the experience of many of us here. This, I suspect, is very common to all of us. And I have certainty that these sentiments are expressed in many other countries other than the UK. Even in this conference so far, I've heard similar comments about from the Nordic countries, from Canada, and from the US, and all that encompasses. So the experience for many of us is the pursuit of departmental key performance indicators, so-called KPIs, which focus on inputs, grants awarded, and outputs, papers in high quality peer-reviewed journals. Promotion and career advancement is dependent on these, and such activities require an entirely different set of skills in research methods than the analytical skills required for philosophical research. But if we are to acknowledge that nursing knowledge is not just the sole product of scientific endeavour, and that it can take many forms, then there must also be a plurality of methods, including analytical skills, needed to gain knowledge, not only in the academy, but in the knowledge needed in order to practice. But the value placed on nursing scholarship in nursing philosophy will influence the content of the curriculum. When papers, even if published in high quality peer-reviewed journals, are described merely as opinion pieces, and where assumptions about the value of nursing knowledge primarily focus on science, then there's likely to be an emphasis on doing rather than thinking about nursing. Final year undergraduate students, for example, and also in master's programs in the UK, are advised to steer away from these so-called opinion pieces. I had to ask somebody what an opinion piece was. I didn't even know what it was. And they're advised to steer away from this in the pursuit of empirical research papers for dissertations. And the emphasis then is not just on evidence-based practice, which again we've heard quite a lot about, but actually the hierarchy of evidence as well, which is seen to be the most important thing to base dissertations on. Curiously, the importance of analytical skills is well recognised in higher education, which actively seeks to develop critical abilities in graduates. My own university, for example, has that statement on the library web pages. Says critical thinking is a key skill that all students need to apply to their studies. You need to be able to ask the right questions. Your writing needs to show the ability to weigh up different arguments. I don't know how you do that just through science. Look at different perspectives, use evidence to help you form your own opinions, arguments, theories, and ideas. So when I mentioned earlier on about working in a Russell Group university, which is research intensive, that definition of research is right across all subjects. It's just this particular focus that healthcare and nursing departments seem to have taken with these fundamental assumptions around science, which does concern me. Highlighting the diversity of healthcare settings and the skills required for contemporary practice, the Nursing and Midwifery Council of the UK Standards of Proficiency in Nursing for Registered Nurses states this, again, echoing this idea of skills in reason and argument, skills in critical thinking, if you like. And I think this is, I was struck with this morning, there was an interesting question about what the assessment was, final assessment for nurses. I think it was in the question was being addressed specifically about Denmark, and I was a bit taken aback by the fact that this sort of British interpretation seems to be slightly different. I think probably closer to the Nordic countries, in that the curricula, although the Nursing and Midwifery Council sets very broad principles for education and standards. It's interpreted by each individual place separately. And so the assessment and the content of the curriculum can be wildly different from institution to institution. And there's no particular final examination process for that. I think it's just worth mentioning that as being different in the UK. Consequently, then, there's an expectation that practitioners will have a deeper understanding of concepts rather than just their practical application. And if we recognise that universities in general and nursing programmes in particular expect students and future practitioners to be skilled critical thinkers, then there must be some provision in the curriculum to learn, develop and practice such skills. It cannot be assumed that students will develop critical thinking skills simply because of being registered in a nursing programme or being registered within higher education. For example, a common experience for me is explaining to undergraduate students that to achieve a higher grade in assignments in the final year of their programme, they must demonstrate skills in critical analysis. They tell me they know this, they tell me they need to know this, they've had even written feedback telling them they need to know that, but on coursework, but they often seem to be at a total loss to know how to do it. A paper I co-authored with my colleague David Clark in 2000 considered this issue. We noted students do get teaching and practice in developing skills in evaluating empirical research. And using that term empirical research there, I'm meaning research with data that's collected and analysed. I'm not making any distinctions between qualitative and quantitative research or anything like that. What I'm meaning is a research paper that's got data in it. But these skills will be of very little value or use to the student when confronted with a paper discussing theoretical questions about nursing knowledge. And many questions about the nature of nursing will be inadequately investigated, relying on these skills alone. Time is also spent on learning systematic processes and the techniques of reflection to use as a learning experience to guide future practice. However, to be truly meaningful, the student also needs to use analytical skills to explore the issues, or there's a danger that the process of reflection may simply be descriptive and subjective. For example, a nurse at the end of a working day might think about how she dealt with an abusive and aggressive relative. She might even be able to explain the person's behaviour by using psychological theory. But she's unlikely to be able to derive anything meaningful about the incident without using analytical skills to explore the issues, the behaviour of the relative and her response to them. Reflection can be a useful process, although I'm not terribly sure it's that useful, but skills are still needed to pull all the facets together of the experience to make it more than just simply being a reflection in a mirror. Hospers suggests that there's an agreement that philosophy deals with questions that cannot be answered empirically. That is, those questions that cannot be answered by statements of ordinary perception, how many people are in this room, by the sciences, conducting experiments, examination of historical events, or by the application of mathematics to a question that requires calculation. Therefore, we could help students, and perhaps we need to help students, to develop analytical skills using philosophical methods to provide a means for thinking about questions about reality, truth, and meaning. As such methods require careful analysis of words, concepts, arguments, and claims, by definition, it demands and develops the sort of critical thinking skills that are expected as outcomes of graduate nurses and for nurses at the point of registration. And we did, of course, hear a very nice example of this from Keith Robinson this morning in this very lovely analysis of caring as being a great example of it. In an early paper published in 1997, Steve Edwards asks this sort of question, and acknowledging skepticism about philosophies, acknowledging skepticism between philosophers of the legitimacy of applied philosophy, Edwards underlines his understanding of philosophy of nursing as an applied philosophy of a practice discipline. And drawing on Schrock, Salisbury and Carnap, three elements were identified. First of all, the conceptual clarification and assessment of arguments, the consideration of traditional philosophical problems that have relevance to nursing theory and practice, and a focus on the framework propositions which constitute nursing discourse and the concepts of which those propositions are comprised, not compromised. And a central theme running through Edward's discussion is that one of the key tasks of nursing philosophy is an analysis of the concepts fundamental to nursing practice. For example, in nursing, concepts such as caring and holism are in common use, and we think that we understand those concepts. But without some analysis of the meaning of those concepts, how are we to make sense of them in practice? In UK undergraduate nursing programmes, I do not see much evidence of this. Many courses are integrated with philosophy, physiology, research ethics, psychology, sociology, all mixed up together under various interpretations of nursing interventions. Concepts such as caring and holism appear to be accepted without any critical review of the fundamental tenets on which such concepts rest. Hence, it's assumed that all patients are or should be cared for holistically, and that all nurses will or should exhibit caring behaviours. But of course, we know that's not always the case. Holistic care in institutions with rules, protocols, and nursing shortages is very difficult to achieve, and some nurses, for different reasons, do not show care and compassion in their work. And this isn't even examining the idea as to whether such terms are even important or desirable in nursing practice. So if we follow Edward's suggestion that one of the key tasks of nursing philosophy is an analysis of the concepts fundamental to nursing practice, then there seems to be an argument that we should engage in this sort of activity with students aiming to become registered nurses. So why don't we do this? Well, one counter argument to this is that the nursing curriculum is very full with essential factual information that students need in order to become competent practitioners. And rather like the UK government's approach to arts in our society, we must focus our energies on ensuring practitioners are numerate and have requisite knowledge, for example, of medicines, use of equipment, prevention of infection, etc. Any time left over can be given to humanities and exploring our history. And certainly at this conference, I've already heard several challenges to this idea of a competency-based education as being the sole focus of it. Clearly, we have a vested interest in producing competent practitioners, but without finding time to actually learn, develop and practice analytical skills, then it's not clear how the aims of a university education and the regulators' standards of proficiency of registered nurses in developing such skills in critical thinking can be achieved. And a second and perhaps more plausible counter argument rests on the appropriate place to introduce exploration of such concepts in the curriculum. This picture here, the writing is written in Swedish, so that's why I haven't bothered about it, although I'm sure some of you in this audience are fluent in Swedish, and I'm indebted to a very early philosophy conference. I've had this for a long time, this picture. It's one of my favourites, this idea that you've got the patient in the bed because we just teach as nurses about philosophy, then they're navel gazing and they forget about the patient. But the more plausible argument may be about where's the appropriate place to introduce these kinds of ideas. For example, undergraduate students have come to learn to become nurses and understand what nursing is and the diverse nature of the profession. And if I want to give my students a good grounding in the perspectives of nursing, what would be the best place to introduce this into the curriculum? Even allowing for similarities in theoretical assumptions, there's no one unified theory of nursing. Therefore, do I introduce them to a selection of theories to consider? And if so, what do I expect them to do with this knowledge for practice? To illustrate this point, I've spent much time over the last 30 years thinking about what nursing is, and some of you have already heard my idle ramblings of this at previous conferences. But if I want to introduce this concept of what nursing is, and I'm not sure that 30 years later I'm any clearer on it, do I offer them a popular definition such as Virginia Henderson's? to give them the answer? Or do I give them that definition and ask them to consider the concepts contained within it and the truth, reality and meaning of the claims that it makes, which is kind of one of my favorite things to do. If we want students to develop a sense of identity of nurses, this could be threatened by not being able to give a definitive or at least a plausible unified definition of the career path that they've chosen. And it's a similar argument that I've heard in interprofessional education. Again, I heard that mentioned quite a lot this morning, particularly from child nurses in the UK. They're a very strong group and they objected to quite a lot of the interprofessional education because they said we spend a lot of time focusing on ensuring that the students we take in are really committed to child nursing, that they understand what they're doing. Why on earth then do we within the first year then start talking about, well, you know, there's other professions as well. So they feel it very important to focus on the identity of what they're doing. So these similar arguments about if you've come in to be a nurse, then isn't it incumbent on us as educators to teach them what nursing is the argument. So perhaps a deeper explanation of what nursing is best left into postgraduate study. And while this is tempting, it doesn't encourage the development of analytical skills in undergraduates that I've so far been arguing for. In a paper published this year, Teaching the Ideas of Others, Is There a Problem?, Martin Lipscomb draws a helpful distinction between teaching focused on getting students to do or think things meeting preordained outcomes and the teaching focused on forms of comprehension that do not necessarily require concrete instantiation in prescribed action or belief. So if I was teaching and interpreting and managing vital signs or of the physiological response to medication, which of course nobody would ever allow me to do, then it seems clear that my teaching needs to be focused on meeting preordained outcomes and forms of comprehension. But understanding a question like what is nursing as a philosophical question rather than one with a prescribed answer falls into the second of Lipscomb's categorizations. So perhaps this is the answer to my dilemma. Lipscomb suggests that being an educator in higher education allows for ideas to be considered that might be antithetical in other circumstances. However, as outlined in the rest of the paper, having the knowledge and skills to explore such concepts in the classroom does require educators competent to address philosophical questions. This in turn requires at least some members of the faculty to be able to pursue scholarship in nursing philosophy, to be competent in leading this sort of discussion with students. And without this, concepts and questions important to the development of the theory and practice of nursing will be inadequately evaluated and risk being taught as subjects with preordained outcomes. I began this section by saying that for many of us, the position of nursing philosophy in universities appears to be tenuous. 100 years ago, Wittgenstein described philosophy as this. He talked about it as being not a theory, but an activity aiming at the logical clarification of thoughts. The result of philosophy not being a number of philosophical propositions, but to make the propositions clear. And this is an approach I support. I have been attempted to explain why I believe that in order to produce knowledgeable thinking practitioners with the analytical skills expected by universities and the regulators of the profession, there does need to be acceptance of the breadth and diversity in acquiring nursing knowledge. Now, I do acknowledge that I'm taking a very particular view of philosophy in proposing this, you know, not everyone might agree with this kind of interpretation of philosophy, but equipping nurses with analytical skills and the ability to develop and present reasoned arguments, I would argue, is crucial for the profession. Skeptics and those committed to the need to focus on learning how to do rather than thinking about nursing will need to be convinced of the value of nursing philosophy. And taking a practical interpretation of nursing philosophy might actually help with this, giving at least 3 benefits. Firstly, it will be instrumental in helping students learn how to think and how to develop a broader spectrum of literature. And secondly, it will provide provide an opportunity to introduce nursing philosophy literature to examine theories and concepts important to nursing. If we don't actually put any value on that, then we're never going to even introduce the literature to the students in the first place. And finally, it will recognise the discipline of nursing philosophy and philosophical research as a legitimate endeavour to deliver these objectives, and the need to have faculty members conversant in this and researching in this area in order to produce the practitioners. So in the final part of the presentation, I want to think a bit about the future. As you can see, I'm more concerned with the discipline of nursing philosophy rather than developing a philosophy of nursing. I see these activities as quite distinct, but also consider it important to avoid a colloquial use of the term philosophy or describing as a philosophy of nursing something that could be more accurately defined as a nursing theory. There is no doubt there are many challenges to the future of nursing, and I've just selected 3 almost at random, which interestingly seem to be quite referring themes at this conference, so perhaps I'm not too off beam with that. My aim in selecting these 3 issues is to demonstrate where, alongside other methods, philosophical analysis can add a useful dimension to this discussion. Rather than just engaging in the discussion per se, I'm only going to be able to sketch out my reasoning for this selection. And I've selected sustainability and climate change, robotics and nursing shortages. So I'm now going to explain why I think these sorts of things you're not going to get very far if you don't use philosophical analysis. So at first sight, these subjects seem to be perfectly suitable to investigation using empirical methods. And while this is undoubtedly essential, there are other philosophical questions that arise from them. Sustainability in nursing is something I haven't given much thought to in the past, but I've recently read some material calling for nurses to take climate change and sustainability seriously. An interesting article in the British Medical Journal by Butterfield, Leffers and Vasquez put forward a persuasive argument showing that nurses moved early to advocate these sorts of changes. Alongside the actual physical things nurses need to do, as explained in this paper, we might want to pause and ask what are essentially philosophical questions, such as what does sustainability mean in general and for nursing in particular? Essentially, these are philosophical questions. While a clear-cut call to arms, the paper also presents moral questions about climate change and indeed suggests that equity, justice and moral equality are important and should be upfront and centred to the argument, all of which are amenable to philosophical as well as empirical investigation. We might want to consider why we should be concerned about the survival of humanity in the first place, or that perennial philosophical question, albeit with a different focus, what is our moral obligation to future generations? Focusing on a nursing response to the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, these authors suggest that there's never been a more pressing need for an intersection of nursing philosophy, embodiment of professional ethics and the staunch commitment to social justice. They see these as no longer being optional extras, but personal and important for personal and professional lives. But to do this effectively, nurses not only need to be change agents, but skilled in reason and argument to put forward coherent ideas, raise and demolish counter arguments to the thesis. I'm kind of thinking there about some of the arguments we heard yesterday about the hidden aspects of discussion, which I thought was fine, but I think we need more than just passion alone. I think you need some fairly sound arguments to go along with that. Robots in care have featured several times at nursing philosophy conferences. For me, beginning with Theodore Metzler and Susan Barnes' dialogue concerning robots in elder care at the 2012 conference in Leeds. Barnes and Metzler showed that far from resolving the problems of scarce nursing interventions, the use of robots raises profound psychological, philosophical and spiritual questions of nursing practice, a recurring theme, and more recent papers on this subject have been there and talked about a lot at this conference. And at the heart of this particular issue is the question of whether robots can exhibit caring behaviours, which of course leads to inevitable questions about the nature of caring. getting back to that again. This is certainly a rich area for philosophical investigation, not least of which being the challenge to the very nature and existence of human nursing care. The use of robots is likely to be thought of as an attractive proposition for healthcare managers concerned with balancing budgets, human resources being one of the most costly. While cautious about dehumanising human care, Gallagher, Naden and Carter-Rudd suggest this. They suggest that it would be unwise for us to rule it out, to rule out a future where there could be a productive human and care bot collaboration. Again, I'd suggest to do this effectively, nurses need to be skilled in reason and argument in order to put forward coherent reasons why humans are essential in the provision of nursing care, if indeed they are, and to raise and demolish counter-arguments to those who believe otherwise. And the final idea I came up was this idea of nursing shortages. The threat to dehumanising nursing care is exacerbated by this idea of nursing shortages. It's a worldwide phenomenon. The ICN, for example, predicts this shortage of 13 million nurses across the world by 2030. The UK Health Foundation's Real Centre Workforce Projections calculate a shortfall of 40,000 nurses in England by 2024, even if the government hits its target of securing 50% more nurses that year. I have no idea how the government is going to secure 50% more nurses. And the nursing regulator gives examples of the number of people who are leaving the profession. Challenges of this magnitude cannot be resolved by recruiting and or training more nurses to replenish the workforce, driving innovations to think differently about nursing, how to provide healthcare, particularly in countries with ageing populations. Robots are definitely seen as having potential, along with changes to educational programs, usually reducing their length. The difficult but certain knowledge that we do not and almost certainly cannot have the sort of nursing workforce we might like to deliver care inevitably leads to questions about the very nature of nursing and takes me right back to that question that's preoccupied me for 30 years. What is nursing? I'm asking what is nursing, not what is a nurse here. This is the sort of question that many governments are wrestling with, and changes in how nursing is identified can be useful and strengthen the profession. But reconfiguration and or erosion can also be dangerous. Fundamental philosophical questions of nursing's professional identity must surely best be addressed by nurses to identify what the necessary and sufficient conditions of nursing are. Philosophical discussions of this sort I've used as examples are important and valuable to a greater understanding of nursing phenomena, and shouldn't be categorized as nice but not essential by those who emphasize doing rather than thinking about nursing. But an obvious omission to my paper thus far has been the link between nursing philosophy and nursing practice. How do we ensure that what we say and do as nurse philosophers is relevant and, more importantly, accessible, particularly for practitioners? Reflecting on the 2004 conference and the launch of IPONS, Geraldine Haynes asked this. She noted that there were few delegates present who would describe themselves as working clinical nursing practice. And even though the practice of nursing was frequently the focus of the discussions, she asked, how do we prevent this becoming elite and foster interest in philosophy amongst practitioners as well as amongst those in the academy? So reflecting on 25 conferences, 22 years of the journal and 19 years of IPONS, I wonder how well we've met Geraldine's challenge, and there is still more work to do here. There are opportunities for growth and development in both the theory and practice of nursing. One of the aims of IPONS is to promote an established philosophy of nursing and healthcare in general as a credible and important field of philosophical and critical inquiry, and ensuring we equip nurses with the analytical skills to face the challenges of the future, even if this means compromise is essential. What I presented here, I hope, is broadly in keeping with Stephen Edwards' view of philosophy of nursing. The influence of his scholarship is immeasurable amongst those of us lucky enough to have known and worked with him. In the first chapter of philosophy of nursing, Steve considered the nature of philosophy of nursing, and he explains the kind of inquiry which constitutes philosophy of nursing to be one that addresses philosophical questions that are not resolved solely by empirical means, and also concerned with second order questions, focusing on first order questions, the acceptance of which the coherence of nursing rests upon. So in conclusion, at this inaugural memorial lecture, it seems fitting to let Steve have the last word and what he describes as a nutshell definition of philosophy that I hope will resonate with you as we think about the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was very fitting topic for the very first inaugural lecture. We are at 5:30.
Yep.
We are at the end of our day, which has been a long and productive and fascinating one. So I say goodbye to you for today. And please be back tomorrow at 9 o'clock for another round of concurrent sessions, and Olga for our final keynote. And the IPONS annual general meeting, which is happening in this room and virtually at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Yes, thank you.
To discuss this with people tomorrow if they wish to.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, everyone. Thank you, virtual attendees. Bye.